If you're looking for hidden reservoirs of power, you are in the right room. So we have this mission, and this mission is to seek out hidden wells of powers between the layers of the universe that can help you fuel your magic. And we also want to find how they've been understood across time and traditions through history and actual concrete ways that they can be used to fuel your spells.
So here we have our itinerary, our table of contents. It starts with relationships and why we should have a little more sympathy, because we're going to dive into the concept of sympathy.
So we're also going to take and use sympathy as a kind of a thread through time. And by following this, we're going to explore different cultures. So keep your eye out on what magical processes are going on in the cultures as we follow sympathy.
And then we're going to go to ancient Egypt because it was a very magical center, a lot of good magic happening there. It's where immanent power meets world soul on a two-way street and gets real stoic about it.
And activation, a cosmic meet and greet, getting it turned on, and that means your magic.
And then Greece, where magical cartography, or where do things live?
And the Renaissance ceremonial magic, going up anyone.
So what is sympathy? It is a phenomena of connection that causes one thing to be affected by another, even across distance or time, by a hidden link.
Why is that important? So that's important because even if you go way, way back in time, up to present time, sympathy is the foundation for magic. We do a magical process, we're affecting something far away. And so that's why it becomes very important to magic. So what is a correspondence?
A correspondence is a system of how items, symbols, or concepts that share familiarity are linked, allowing them to influence one another.
So they're your magical toolbox. So they are what you use to engage the forces of sympathy and draw them down into your magic. And cultural lenses can affect what correspondence system is in play at the time.
Sympathy and correspondence are very closely related.
So correspondence, it's the system of what things correspond to those powers that you want to get down into your magic and how they can be combined. And sympathy
is why that happens. It is the medium in which everything takes place.
So correspondence gets the participation award. And the reason that is because sometimes people think that when you use correspondences and you have a thing that corresponds to another thing, some sort of energy comes up from nowhere and zips across, right, and powers the thing. But that's actually not quite what's happening. What's happening is that when the link is activated, this thing at a metaphysical level actually is the power that powers the item, the spell, the ritual. They become kind of intertwined.
Part of the metaphysical substance exists within them.
And then essence, qualities, and powers move over into the other thing because they're occupying it. This is caused because of shared traits. And we're going to take a look at some of those shared traits.
And we'll be going through each of these. So the first thing is quality.
So this is sympathy by shared quality, and that means taste, touch, smell, things that you can easily recognize. So this is a very easy to identify correspondence. In this case, we have lavender and we have amethyst. Now both are purple. Purple is associated with calm. That means they are both participating in this kind of overarching pattern in the universe of calmness, and you can tell because of the purple. Now, to carry that a little bit further, if you want to look at, say, the property like Jupiter as a higher power that you want to link into your spell, or Athena for strategic calm, they both involve calm, optimistic calm and strategic calm. And so lavender and amethyst participate in Jupiter and Athena energy, and you can use those things to anchor those into your magical work.
And another way that sympathy can work is through shared property. That is to do with the effects they produce. For instance, there are a variety of things which are associated with heat, such as nettles, black mustard seed, Mars, and you can link between any of those if you want to deal with something dealing with heat, aggression, or stimulation. They have the same metaphysical properties within them.
And then there's sympathy through shared essence. And that's when something has the same core nature.
Yes, for instance, every bit of fire has a little bit of the sun in it. And so you can always use a little bit of the fire to connect with the sun, or things related to the sun, such as Apollo or the fire of inspiration.
So you could use a little bit of fire to anchor the power of Apollo down into your spell. Okay, there's sympathy through shared story, and this is one of my favorite ones. Okay, this is when stories carry a lot of empowered and charged meanings and patterns in them. So if I were to take a stone with a sword in it and put it right in the room, all of a sudden, from everybody's mind would land, the whole of the story and the associations. There would be the Lady of the Lake, there would be Merlin, there'd be the sparrow that Arthur turned into, and that comes into the consciousness of everyone in the room. This is a wonderful way in a ritual to get everybody suddenly visualizing in the same place at the same time, focused. Now, this also goes beyond just what we have in our minds. There's like group mind, which is a pattern that is created by a number of minds together. And it's made of a metaphysical substance that is woven into reality. And by using this, it actually activates that higher well of power and connects your spell or your ritual to that. And so it is participating, and it goes beyond that too. Because when you have a story that shares a same story pattern, like in this one, they're all about merit over strength. The Lord of the Rings, Robin Hood, the Sword and the Stone. They're all about merit over strength. So because up in that upper level, if they are sharing the same qualities, they kind of bleed together and they create an even higher umbrella of power. When you use that, it activates all the way up to the chain, and you have a greater resource for your rituals and spells.
There is also sympathy through shared purpose, which means they have the same role, for instance.
So sovereignty and divine authority, believe it or not, have been around for a really long time. And so the repetition of human interaction regarding those topics for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and people being involved and having feelings and thoughts regarding that, it projects and combines into a metaphysical structure in the universe. So if you want to tap into that and make that present in your spell or in your working, you could use a crown and a scepter. Now, a crown is used to declare the right to rule, and a scepter is used to declare the power to enact that rulership. That's why they've been used in coronations for hundreds of years. And so you have got a pattern. It's like a well-worn groove in the universe for that power being associated with those things. So if you use them in your ritual, it anchors that down into your ritual and your spells.
And there's also through function, where they serve the same task. For instance, there was the god Ptah in ancient Egypt, and he would speak the world into being. And in Egypt, there were builders, and they would use tools to create things into being. So with Ptah, you have a god who is the god of things that are created and the god of divine utterance. Both of those things fall under the same deity, and therefore he is the deity of manifest form.
And so when builders used the tools to manifest what they were doing, that makes tools a correspondence to that power.
And this is a really handy thing because Egypt was very magical. And the reason it was magical was because of a substance called Heka. Heka was the primordial force behind all of creation, and it was Heka powerful.
So the way this works in Egypt, because now we're going to take these tools we visited and we're going to see them play out in Egypt. So in Egypt, Heka was the force behind all of creation. And in their mythology, they had, before anything ever was, there was this big pool of dark water. And in that pool of dark water was the possibility of anything and everything that could happen. The only problem is that it couldn't emerge or do anything on its own. It was just kind of sitting there static. Heka is the force that interwove into that primordial pool, and it is the force that activated it, and then those possibilities could emerge into actuality. And it continues to happen. So Heka is consistently manifesting reality, and it never stopped. It's not like a one-time event.
So we're used to this formula, where there is the deity above, there is us below, and that is the way that a lot of people these days visualize things. But for the ancient Egyptians, everything was on one level playing field.
And part of one world. There wasn't levels removed from here. Everything was here. So that meant that if the gods could use Heka because they are here and they're part of a world made of Heka, then humans can use it also. And they have equal access. Now, they're not equal to the gods, right? Because they're immortal and the whole of creation depends upon them exercising their powers. But you would even see it was not uncommon for them to threaten gods. The priest might say, I will burn your image if you don't help me with this healing. Or they might say, I will reveal your true name if you don't help protect me from my enemies. So that was kind of an interesting thing about Egyptian magic that was different than some other areas. So you might wonder, if Heka is an equal opportunity for everyone, why am I looking for jumper cables here? And the answer to that is that these connections can become dormant and latent, and they need to be activated in order to kind of spring to life. That is something that happens naturally. But when a ritualist goes into ritual and performs a spell, they are doing something intentionally. They have techniques to do something intentionally that happens naturally. So how do they do that? So you might wonder, what are these activation methods? And I don't want you to worry about taking notes, because the activation methods are all in there, and those categories or things are in your handout. What we see a lot of today is talking about charging items. And charging items works like a battery. We use our own energy, or we raise energy, or we transfer energy from one thing and we cram it into whatever it is, and it holds that charge. But correspondence and activation works differently.
Because correspondence is a conversation with the absent. Now, imagine that you look over and they're stealing your acorns, but you can't get to them. They are not there anymore. So you make a little doll and you bind that doll, and by creating it to have similar qualities to the person who stole the thing, and you are connecting it and therefore binding the person who stole your acorns.
So what this means is that you're not using your own energy. You activate the correspondences, and this one thing comes and participates in the other thing. That's how correspondences and activation works. So the result is you get the effect, but you have maybe gone off and gone to work, right? It's continuing to be powered by this other power source that you've set up. So the formula for that is the symbolic form, which is the correspondence, plus the Heka, which is existing, ritual activation, and that means that that symbolic thing becomes the thing. It becomes involved.
We're going to be going through a lot of different techniques, and we're not going to cover all of these. They're all in your handout, so let's get into them.
So we have sound, voice, spoken words. Those are all activators. So what is happening with that? When someone is going to speak something and declare something to be in a ritual, it starts with a presence inside that ritualist. And they breathe in, and then they issue this force out from their mouth, and it's a vibration, and it fills the room. And that's an actual presence. That becomes an anchor for the powers that are being incanted. And that can include things like a true name of a deity, The true name is a representation of that deity that you just put forth in encoded voice vibration. And so that activates. And a deity, because it's linked, can become present. Now, I want to make sure that people understand that this doesn't mean that you do this thing and you have automatic command over that thing, right? Because things like deities and spirits and intelligences, they have their own agency. But what you can do is when you are choosing what powers you want to work with, look at your purpose and then take a look at what is the power that falls under their purview. They would feel like, oh, I belong here because this is what I'm about. And that's how you kind of get that alignment and that participation, is through cooperation.
There's also gestures and movements, because the gestures and movements direct the force and produce the effect. Now, if you look here, not sure if you can see it in the back, but down here there's a representation of the opening of the mouth ritual. And they've got this tool. Before we were talking about the importance of tools, we have the tool right here, and they would touch the tool to the mouth. And in doing so, they would open the mouth on a metaphysical level. And in doing so, they would allow the spirit to enter into the item, statue, or mummy, and then have it be ensouled, have it have the metaphysical quality within it. And so by that gesture, by that movement, they are embodying, they are ensouling a statue.
All right, so that brings us to statues. Statues are the form of the deity. And because it shares a form, it encourages it to come ahead and participate in that statue and be in that statue. But there were other processes that they used to continue the presence of that deity in the statue, and that involved acting like it's there. If you ignore somebody, what happens? They go away, right? So they would have priests and priestesses who would wash, anoint, dress, feed every day. That statue, they would have a regular interaction with it to keep the presence of the deity there.
And there's also images and drawings. Earlier we discussed the idea of how you could threaten the god. You could say, I will break your statue, I'll break your image if you don't do it, I say. Well, right here we have an image, and this is an actual ancient artifact that was ritually broken for that purpose, because the images have that being in them. They are participating in the same energy.
And now we have amulets. Now amulets are really interesting because the activation method for amulets is partly the inscription. An inscription on it, it is like an encoding of the power, the deity, the force, and instructions right in it. So when they take that and ritually at the correct astrological time, usually they'd have astrological timing, where that force was most present. They would encode it onto the item and it would activate that item and it would be present in the amulet. They also consecrated it in the act of wearing it, also kept it activated. Circumambulation. Circumambulation was an important activator. And what was happening is that when they took their hand and they moved it around an object, or when they circumambulated and walked around the room, or when they took a whole procession and walked around in the entire temple, or even a whole town, because they were very into this circumambulation, they were orienting that space to cosmic order, to divine order. It's like taking the space or the object and then sinking it into place so that it is connected to the powers that you want to be present there. So circumambulation was actually a big deal.
I'm going to be honest, after studying this stuff, it's so weird saying divine order and not saying ma'at.
Activation is what turns that connection on. And that's what makes it important. Now we want to take a look at something called contextual correspondences. And that was a type of correspondence that was being used in the temple period of Egypt. In Egypt, in their temples, they had, their statues, they had their correspondences, they had their tools, they had all of these things set up, and their correspondences were context bound by myth, by features in the natural world, and by cultural context. So let's get an example of that. The stone, lapis lazuli, played a prominent part in their myths. It's a blue stone with gold flecks. It looks a lot like the night sky with all the stars. Who's in the sky? It's the deities, right? The deities are in the sky. So when you read their myths and look at their pictures, you're going to see right here, there is a lot of lapis lazuli on their regalia. Their hair is lapis lazuli. It's a recurring theme, and it's baked into their myths.
But the problem with that is that it had to be lapis lazuli. There could not be any substitutions. You couldn't have some other celestial stone. It had to be that. So that's where we are with Egypt. So we're just going to leave them at the bar. Everything will be fine.
We're going to travel to Minnesota and take a look at how does contextual correspondences work in a ritual setting.
The nickname for where we are right now is Paganistan, because Paganistan means the place where the pagans are. And we have a very large pagan population.
But we kind of thought, well, what is our context? It certainly isn't going to be Egyptian gods. It's not going to be pyramids or deserts or crocodiles or any of that stuff. It is not our context. So we wanted to use the theory but apply it to the powers that are immanent here, which we thought was a very good idea. Our ritual that we did, the topic was wards and protection. So we thought, well, what are the immanent powers here that are associated with protection?
Well, we've got the Mississippi River, because that'll wash away anything. We've got frozen features, and that does protect us. I have not seen one alligator since I moved here.
It's very good on boundaries.
Yes. We've got pine trees, and you know that pine trees are protective because nothing grows next to them, nothing grows under them. They have that way of just pushing away everything else.
And any tree that actually does that, that's a tree that corresponds to protection.
Yes, we also use walnut for that sometimes. And we also have indigenous plants that are corresponding to that we got at Magus Books and Herbs, because Magus Books and Herbs is a wonderful shop, and we appreciate them greatly.
Other immanent powers for here are celestial powers of the sun and the moon. And that's because they go over the sky and they keep watch on everything. And they also establish cosmic order in this cycle. So we decided we would use those because of their protective qualities. And the idea behind this, and this is how the correspondences work, is that we would use those immanent powers and we would orient and activate the links between our wards and the powers of the land. So the powers of the land would rise up in those wards, because the wards are anchors, to establish protection from harm. And so it would be powered by the land itself.
And we did this by utilizing sigils. And the sigil that we chose was a pre-existing sigil that represents the place where we are right now, where you can plainly see the blue of the sky, the green of the land, the white of the snow. And within the symbol itself are the lakes and rivers of Paganistan. This is an actual map of the Twin Cities.
Okay, so this is a sigil, this is a symbol for Paganistan that's existed for several years. So the important thing about sigils, because this is going to come up again later, this is kind of a plot point, is that sigils are like an encoding of other powers or directions for those powers to follow. So that's why we used that, because it would connect to the land. And here are some of the sigils that we made or prepared for that ritual. We used a stone because the powers of the land are going to recognize stone and say, that is of us. We can be here, we belong. And then we put the sigil of Paganistan on the top of it, and there are actually little red arrows there to signify the pushing away of harm.
And we also had an entire cauldron full of sigils. And each of those is attached to pine here, and it's on a pine disc, and then on the back of it we have the sigil with the arrows pointing out again.
So again, pine is considered to be a North Country tree. It is indigenous to the land. The land can take a look at that and say, yeah, it feels good to be here. I want to rise up and be in this particular ward. And so then...
Our process of how we activated it, though.
Now, this is not the whole outline for the ritual. This is just some things that we did that were inspired by the way Egyptians did things. And we thought, okay, contextual correspondences, here we go. Ritual purification and blessing. They always did ritual purification and blessing because they believed that in order to go into ritual and into sacred space, you had to be clean because you were orderly, and therefore divine order and divine powers were easily in the same space as you were.
And we also circumambulated. We circumambulated around the room. We circumambulated the tools. We did so much to connect to the divine order.
And then we did not cast any circles because that's not something that they would have done. What we used instead are wards. And that is congruent with what they would have done. And also it brings the energy of protection in wards into the space. So that's what we did. And then we also use sound, chanting, music, drums, and shakers. So any words that we used were aligned to the powers of power and protection. The sound activated the energy in the space.
And then we blessed it with water from the Mississippi River, which we dipped a pine bough into and sprinkled it around the space to really bless and protect the space.
So that actually brought the powers physically into the room. So then we did not call the elements, okay, because the Egyptians would not have done that. What they do call is the cardinal directions. Now, they don't do that in every ritual, and in some rituals they might only call 1 or 2 cardinal directions that were pertinent to the magical work that they were doing. But we decided that we would call all 4 because that way we would be orienting it to this particular symbol. And when we called each of the cardinal directions, we called the land powers that were associated with those directions. So it wasn't elements, it was features of the land. And then there is the amulets and sigils that also corresponded. Now, you might say, well, how did that work?
Great, worked great.
So here's what we found happened. We did this ritual with our current class of students. And it was actually, for the most part, it was the first ritual where they met each other because we've got this hybrid class going on where some of it's online and some of it's in person. So they hadn't met each other. Many of them had not been into a public group ritual ever before. However, they all had experienced those powers. They all had lived them. They were part of their embodied living experience. They shared the image. It brought them into focus where they could reach out to those powers in a way that was all aligned. They were actually pretty amazed, and we were amazed at how easily they stepped into that ritual and everything came together. So then we took those wards, and by that time, because people had brought stuff, there were about 200 of them, we put them all around the Twin Cities.
We circumambulated the Twin Cities.
We did. We circumambulated the Twin Cities, taking the 694, 494 route, and we kind of made a grid with them.
You know, I'm really looking forward to seeing those Egyptians again, because we left them at the bar. I'll bet everything's fine. They're still happy at that bar. Everything's going to be fine. Oh no! There's party crashers!
So in 30 BC, the Romans conquered Egypt. And what they did is, over a period of 100 years, they defunded the temples. They couldn't survive in the temples. They had no resources for that. And they went out into the communities surrounding Egypt, and they did magic for hire. Now, it was a very, very multicultural community, but there was a problem, and that was that their correspondences were rigid and contextual. And a lot of the things that they needed, like their iconography, their statues, their resources, they were in the temple. And they needed a solution to that problem. And so they needed a portable magical system. So in this hybrid magical culture, outside the temples, they came across the Stoics. And the Stoics had a system of sympathy. It was not a magical system. This non-magical system The reason that the Stoics wanted a system of sympathy was for purely scientific reasons. They had taken it upon themselves to try to come up with a theory about why astrology works. So why do the planets and the stars have an effect of what goes on here when they are so far away? And what they came up with was a system that actually explained in a scientific terms and methods why everything is connected. And it wasn't context bound. It had a much bigger playing field than any particular myth system.
Whereas the Egyptians had Heka, the Stoics had a substance called pneuma. And pneuma created everything, and everything was created within it, and everything was connected through pneuma. Now the great thing about this, it's a lot like Heka. Now, instead of being the vertical column that we're used to, it is again everything on a level playing field.
In the Stoic system, it was system-based and flexible. Heka is context-bound, but they had enough similarities between their two systems that the Egyptians could take and adopt non-contextual correspondences.
So, whereas with the Egyptian system, there were no substitutions. If you needed lapis lazuli and you didn't have lapis lazuli, you could not substitute. But with the Stoic system, substitutions were suddenly possible, which led to the ability to have a more portable magic tradition.
Now this is the beginning of correspondence tables and also a tradition of magical handbooks. This is the Greek magical papyri.
And these days we're used to like the Llewellyn book of correspondences, but they didn't have that then. This is like the beginning of creating a book of correspondences.
Right, they don't have the books yet, but they do have non-contextual correspondences. Now that we have seen how the Egyptians met and integrated with the Stoic system, let's take a look at what the Platonic influence was, because the Platonic influence had to do with a layered reality, not this everything is here all at once. There's going to be kind of a ladder system here.
Anytime you're talking about Western history, eventually there's going to be a Platonic influence.
This is from Plato's Republic. It's called the divided line. And this, he never, ever, ever meant for this to have a magical application, because Plato didn't actually approve of magic, but that wouldn't prevent people from using it for magic for the next 2,000 years. So his theory is this. Up here we have something that he called the good. And the good, it had like an ultimate potential for everything. But it didn't change, and it couldn't come down where we are, because as soon as it would come down here, it would become something. So, and that would kind of be the end of the universe, so that would be no good. And so it had to stay up here, but it could emanate. So down it would emanate through all these layers. And in the first section, what was created in those emanations is abstract concepts. Things like love, beauty, truth, but not necessarily in a particular thing. It's just the higher power. And this is where you get higher patterns of particular things like growth. Here's our example right here. Now, as the emanations continue downward, those things start to form into slightly denser metaphysical matter. So it's not matter like we have here, but it is a metaphysical substance, and you get patterns and designs and ideas. Like in this case, an example is the astral form of an acorn. Growth can be in a lot of other things, and you'd see patterns for those things, but in this case we've got an acorn. But it's not a real acorn that you can touch. So down it would continue in these emanations until it impressed into the physical world, and it was a denser form of matter. So here we have our first physical acorn, and it's a particular acorn. It's not the idea of acorns. It's the acorn that is here, there, the one you can pick up and hold in your hand. Because you can pick it up and hold it in your hand, it becomes a correspondent, because everything that it is moved through in the emanations has come down and is part of that acorn. Now below this, you have images. Now they are not even real acorns. So when a human being is created, part of their creative power is to do like a painting or a sculpture or have a thought in their head or something like that. that is an image of the real world. In this way, this section is a mirror image of this section. Up here, the good is creating something and comes up with a pattern and idea. Down here, mankind can also come up with ideas. And so this is a little bit like this. And we know what happens with shared things.
And all of these contain a little bit of the same metaphysical substance.
You can see here, this higher general abstract form is part of what creates the astral form. It goes down into the acorn, and then it comes down and is part of the image, which is why these things are connected.
Now today we would refer to this as the physical, mental, and spiritual levels of existence. And I'm pretty sure everyone here understands what the physical part of reality is. We're all familiar with that, I'm guessing. The mental layer is a little bit more complicated, but it's a very big thing. So to dive into this just a little bit, we're going to talk about extreme hydrocephalus, because hydrocephalus is a condition that messes with the brain. And in 1980, there was a study where half the people with extreme hydrocephalus were found to have intellectual impairment. You'd expect that with a condition that's messing with the brain. But half had above average intelligence. That's weird. You wouldn't expect that from something like this, which leaves the thought, maybe the part that's doing the thinking, the mind, isn't necessarily completely in that brain. So this is not a new idea. Rene Descartes,
He had an idea that the mind was actually made of an intellectual substance that was separate from the body.
what I really find fascinating is the work of the spiritualists. For the last 150 years, spiritualists have been documenting, connecting, and communicating with spirits. And a thing that they found, which shouldn't be a surprise to anyone here, is that after people die, they have memories from their lives. Now, if your memories were being stored in your brain, then after you died, you shouldn't have them anymore. But if they're being stored somewhere else, then after your body is no longer alive, they're still all good. Which makes it clear that maybe the brain is just an interface for the mind. Now, way I like to think about this, if you had a radio and you went to a place where no one had heard of a radio before, and you tune it in and music starts coming out of it, they would assume that the music is being produced by the box. But the box is just receiving and amplifying the signal. So maybe that is what is happening with us. Maybe the brain is a receiver that can be tuned to accept input.
And it is also connected to the body. So the brain is connected to the body and communicates with the body, but it's also receiving signal from the mind.
Now we have an idea of what the body and the mind. To get a little bit into the spirit, for the purpose of what we're doing today, we don't have to go too deep into this, just the idea of inspiration. Because I'm guessing everyone here at some point has experienced knowing things and you don't know why you know it. It's just suddenly you know something. You experience that divine inspiration. And since we're already familiar with this, we're already familiar with the idea of spirit. And so we're already, fundamentally, everyone here already knows that you have a body, a mind, and a spirit. So it's not that big of a leap to go to the cosmological view of, if we can have this, maybe the universe can have this also and have a physical, mental, and spiritual layer.
So we see the mental level of the universe at play around us when maybe you've experienced it where there's a room in your house or a building that you visited and that's experienced a traumatic event. The traumatic event is full of emotions and thoughts that imprint into the mental layer of that space. So the mental layer is a metaphysical substance that can take impressions. And people who are psychic can come in and maybe read what happened in that space. Other people who aren't as psychic may just go into that space and get a kind of an odd vibe and feel uncomfortable. That's an example of the mental layer of the universe having a memory, just like our minds have a memory. But it doesn't have to be just in the physical realm. Up higher in the ladder, you have structures and you have patterns that are also embedded or made of metaphysical substance and that are connected down into various things in this physical world.
Now, if we're going to nutshell what Plato is doing, it would be the visible realm, the forms, and the good. And that can be very useful when we do very practical things in our magic. Like, for instance, if you've got a magical knife. Now, when we're talking about the magical knife in this sense, we're going to start by looking at the spiritual quintessence of the knife. And this is that sense of will, the abstract quality of what it represents in a magical context. Then below that would be the mental layer of the knife, where it is the form of the knife, the ideal of it that it is aspiring to. All the people who've used it in magic before are contributing to this mental layer thought form of what it could be.
And this is more specific. Up here you've got general qualities, more all the things that this magical knife could be. Down here you have defined more. What is it that is going to be in this magical knife of yours? What are the things that it's going to be able to do? How does it connect to this power?
And so when you're holding that physical knife, you're not just holding the physical knife. You are connecting to the mental and spiritual layers. This is why we use tools. We don't need tools if all we're going to do with the tool is channel our own energy. But if we're connecting with the energy of the tool itself and combining our energy with its energy, then we are multiplying our energy and creating more magical power.
Because we're drawing from a more of a cosmological layers into that knife. Now there's another way that people use tools, and that is this particular psychic structure of it. Sometimes it's not out there, they build it within themselves. It becomes part of their character. That's actually an important part of many traditions. So when they pick up that athame, what's being activated is the athame within themselves. And that tool is the activator for this thing that they have within themselves. Okay, so here we have, this is a story time. This particular story that we're going to talk about has influenced magic for hundreds of years. It is a story that was written by Plato. It's his only myth. It's the only myth he ever wrote. Everything else is written in a different style. And it is the story of how the world soul was made.
And this is from the Timaeus. If you were to consider the most important books in Western Esoteric tradition, Timaeus is generally listed in the top 5.
And this part, all these things here, these are our parts list. It's our exploded diagram of parts lists. This is what it's going to be made out of. So in the beginning, there was the good, and there was nothing else but the good. And the good had the potential for everything, but it could only reflect upon itself, or it would start to become a particular thing. But in its reflections, there was a surge. And from out of that surge came the demiurge. And the demiurge could create. He was a craftsman, and he looked up at this good and he decided, well, that is just about the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. I am going to make something identical to that, except for this thing that I make, I don't want to babysit it. It's going to have to move and change and evolve. And I think what I'm going to do is make it a soul. So that way it can take care of itself. It can have its own mission and agency. It went ahead and it took some substances that is too complex for me to describe right now, and it laid them out and it made strips of them. And in the first strip, it made the circle of same, and that circle of same was going to stay stable. It was going to be a force for unity. It was going to, and it was as close to being similar to the good as he could possibly get. Neither of them are changing. And then the next circle was the circle of different, and that's this purple circle right here. And that would be in charge of change. And he riveted them together here in here so that they are connected. And it would move and change. And it would be in charge of cosmic order. So the next layer was made from a whole set of sections that was originally taken from the circle of different, from its side of it. And they were the 7 revolutions, and they had to do with the planets. And he spaced them out so that they would correspond to musical integers, the ones for that time, like the chords, because this is going to be a type of music box. It's also going to be a clock, a timepiece, because when he sets the planets on the rings, it moves, and the planets and the moon and the sun keep time. And they set cosmic order, and they make patterns. It is the engine of the world soul. And the last thing that he set in there was Earth, the anchor of the physical world. So we actually are living in a timepiece. And because of the musical quality, sometimes I think of it as a cuckoo clock. Another aspect of this that is worth calling out because it's a plot point for later is here you have the celestial realm, and that's the unmoving stars. So any of the powers of the stars are from this section. The next section in here, that is the realm of the planets that do move. And that's the planetary intelligences. And then you've got this third section. So we actually have a 3-part circle here. Per this story, there were leftover bits from making the world soul. And that's the leftover bits is what he made the soul of man from. So it was made in the same image as the world soul. Just as the world soul, this section is about truth, knowing, intellect, the things that over here in the rational soul, that would be, hey, those things are sewn into us. There's things we know, not because we figure it out. It just comes into certainty. And then there's also discursive reasoning, and that fits at the top here in the rational portion of the soul, because that's our higher thinking ability. It's not a gut level knee-jerk reaction. It's the fact that we can reason things out. Down here we have patterned thinking and temporal thought that corresponds to here. Over here, that's our spirited soul. It is our will and the feisty part of us. It's our moral drive, and that's our engine, just like this is the engine for the world soul. And over here we have sense perception, belief, opinion, imagination, and that's part of our appetite of soul that is about desire and generation. And actually, that's particularly important that this rational part of our soul kind of rules from above, because otherwise that appetite of soul just wants to kind of eat, drink, and party. And you can see that there is synchronicity between the world soul and man. And what this means is that man becomes a correspondence for the world, the cosmos. And these systems here show all the levels of the cosmos, and man participates in all of those levels. And that is why we can connect through our consciousness. We can connect to all those levels of the universe and bring them into our rituals and our spells. So let's take a look at this. And this is who is in the world soul neighborhoods. So if we look at the top, this section here, this part of that is the circle of same and the circle of different, we find higher intelligences, archetypes, forms, divine patterns, and radiating chains of being.
These are the higher things that we aspire to.
Yeah, and they're way up there. They may be hard to connect to, so we need middle things sometimes to connect us to the higher things. So then we get to, from the middle section, where the planetary powers are, we have planetary intelligences, zodiac rulers, egregores. Now, egregores, it's worth taking a pause to explain that briefly. The egregores that we have for divine powers and gods, they are created from human metaphysical substance of our mind. We have, as a collective conscious, ways that we have put into human terms the forces of the gods, and that becomes part of a egregore, a well of power. And it is through this that higher power from here says, okay, now I have the symbols and the language and the things that I need to be able to communicate to these people, because otherwise this is really way out of our context up here. That's why egregores come into a high place of importance, because they are an interface between ourselves and deities. And then we get to sense perception, that inner part. That's where we find nature spirits and the anima of plants. Anima is like the soul piece that exists in anything, whether it's animate or not, whether it's an object or a living thing.
And all of these are really important because these are the core things that correspond and have a bit of the material, the metaphysical substance that we find in the things above. So we can really use all of these for our magic.
Right, the high things, the higher powers are connected to, and bits of them are in the low things. Why is metaphysical cartography important?
It's because of what you do with the map. You follow it.
And why is this important for sympathy? Because it forms the foundation. When you think about sympathy, all of this that we just unpacked with this world soul and everything, that theory is the foundation behind sympathy.
And Plato didn't intend for that to be the way it would be, but
it has been used for magic since then.
And we're going to go into the Neoplatonists who showed how that became part of magic, because they brought the magic to it.
And they are the metaphysical cartographers. So this is how this came into being. One of the first Neoplatonists that are important is Plotinus. And he stated his big gig was that he wanted to unite with God and resonate with God, to elevate the soul and elevate consciousness. That was his gig. And he said that the universe is not a mechanical bag of nuts and bolts. It is spiritual, it's divine. And so this over here is his levels that he stated happened. There's the one, divine intellect, the soul, which was above the divided line. And then there's nature and matter. And he said, humans ascend only through contemplation, no magic. He said the whole thing of ritual and magical practice actually gets in the way, because all you have to do is turn inward.
And I don't know about you, but this is how I experience my soul. I don't experience my soul down here. I experience my soul up here.
Okay, so Porphyry was his student, and he was totally down and in with what his teacher had said. But he had some questions because he looked at what he was laying down, and he said, well, look what's going on in our culture that isn't quite connecting. And I have these questions. So one thing that they would do at that time is they could write an open letter, and they would send this letter out to scholars and out to the students of the time. And they would wait to see if they got an answer back. So what happened is that his student, Iamblichus, answered the letter, except he pretended to be an Egyptian priest. And the reason he pretended to be an Egyptian priest was to give what he was saying a little bit more altitude, because he didn't feel like he had enough. Because what he was all about is bringing the magic back. He argued that Egyptian magical techniques were essential for being able to rise and have commune with God. And he said it was essential because we are embedded in the physical universe. And here we are surrounded by these objects that all have this piece of divinity in them. So let's use all the magical methods that we unpacked earlier in this presentation to ascend this ladder and commune with God. So he was considered to be the father of theurgy. How his theory differed is that he not only wanted to go up, but down. And in his theory, he would use correspondences and magical methods to make himself and the ritual tools and the rooms and the spaces, inviting to whatever the deity or the force was that he wanted to commune with. This was the beginning of divine possession. Now, it wasn't an overwhelming type of possession. It was actually called more like an infilling. So the theurgist, he retained possession of himself, but yet he elevated his soul, because the deity or the power would ascend down, elevate his soul, and the soul would ascend up. That was his theory. So there were two kinds of rituals. So the two kinds of rituals were ascent and descent. One of them was like, hey, let's invite this god down and we're going to take a ride up. And the other one was, let's just invite this higher power down and let's get it really well anchored in this amulet, right? Let's really get it anchored into this healing process. And so those were the two types of rituals that they did. And he said Egyptian magic was essential.
This is the beginning of doing this in the Western Esoteric tradition, as opposed to the spiritual traditions and the shamanic traditions and all those others.
Here it is. Here's the list of all these things that we already went through in our presentation. And he says, use all of these. And he brought the Egyptian magic back. Then we have Proclus.
He made lists. Oh man, did this guy make lists. We have some of his lists in a handout for you, so because it's big.
So in your handout, you're going to find a portrayal of Proclus's list. It's a very long and detailed division of what all the layers of the universe are and what are the powers that you can find in them and where they are. So it is not exactly like his method, because you can't portray that on one piece of paper, because he had a whole theory that you can't just boil down to one list. But if you ever wanted to take a look at his Proclus's work, it's worth looking at. So, and that was kind of, as far as magic goes, that piece of work is going to be carried forward into later types of magic. And it was used then too, at the time, for magic, although Proclus wasn't really, advocating that. This one. He reshaped correspondences as divine chains, and also said that lower correspondences contain the higher presence that can be followed up the chain.
Now, Proclus didn't do anything by halves, so he created a lot of divine chains. And we're just going to look at one, and this is even a truncation of the one. It's huge. But this is the divine chain of Helios. And we're going to start up here at the top where we have pure illumination. Way up, before you even think about the sun, you have pure illumination. Then you have clarity and insight. And then only way down here do you actually get to the physical sun in the sky. And then down here you have a list of things that correspond to it. And this is just 4 things I pulled off the list. That list went on for a long time. For instance, if you have sunflowers, you can connect to the physical sun. You can connect to insight. You can connect to pure illumination, because they all contain a little bit of the same metaphysical substance.
And that became very useful in magic. So how does theurgy impact us today? Consecrated tools. They're not just the object, they can connect to the divine form of the tool and higher powers.
It is developed through the Western Esoteric tradition that we can have drawdowns and commune with the deities directly through ourselves.
And invocations and circle casting. We're going to see how our circle casting has been influenced dynamically by these things.
The thing that I think is really essential about all of this is that by working up and down that ladder, we aren't just working magic, we are being priests. And I love the idea that we are the modern priests and priestesses of magic.
All right, so for historical reasons we don't have time to get into, actually we'll just call it Christianity. It was made illegal for pagans to teach. And so by a series of events, these wisdoms became absent and less known in Western Europe. And this is where they traveled. They had already been shared over here in this area of the mat. And Baghdad became very busy at a period of time collecting wisdoms and science from all kinds of areas, India, Persia, Egypt, all over. And they brought them together in Baghdad in immense learning institutions and reservoirs of knowledge. And then when they went and moved across Africa, and they settled into Spain, and there they built vast places of learning. And that's where this stuff was kept. So when the Christians in Europe came down from this direction and took Spain, they had access to all of those places. And this brought about the translation age. And so they got to busy translating all of those things that had been translated into Arabic languages back into Latin, which was the scholarly language of the time. And then we had access. So before the translations occurred, we had magic, as in charms, spells, invocations, and there were Christianized versions of that. But the theory behind of it was lost, and we didn't have the latter anymore. After the translations,
we had finally the magic in ritual systems. They started to be able to organize things in a reasonable way and create books of magic, the grimoires that we so love. And as they were translating things, there were a lot of different versions of the Platonic cosmos because the Islamic philosophers were fascinated by it. And so this came out. And one thing you find in this, it's a lot of circles. Now, another thing that came forward was astrology, because there's a huge amount of well, throughout this presentation, there have been several times we've talked about how astrology has been a motivating thing with the Stoics, with the way Plato designed his cosmos. And the Islamic philosophers also had a great interest in astrology. And the funny thing about astrology, again, it's a lot of circles, because the circles connect to the cosmological order. So it's hardly surprising that once people started developing the grimoires, circles became popular. And the circles were these, oftentimes they were just little sigils, but sometimes they were sigils so big that you could walk into them. Now, one of the turning point would have been the Sworn Book of Honorius, because after that, pretty much every grimoire had a section on circles.
So how this went is that they'd have the circle, and on the circle, they would often inscribe 3 parts into the circle, and in the different layers they would have sigils for corresponding with planets, corresponding with higher powers and angels, so that it was a representation down here of that cosmology and all the powers up there that they wanted to connect with. They'd make all these things specific to what they wanted to connect with. So when they stepped into that circle and they cast that circle, it activated. And they were in a stream where this whole set of powers above activated and became present in the symbols here of the circle, and that's where they were standing as the mediator. They had all of that baked into their soul, and they became the place where the heavens and the earth meet. And they became, through their spiritus, able to be the connecting element of all of that. And that's where they would do those magic. And that is the theory behind the circles that you see today.
Now, for those of us who practice in a tradition that involves magical circles, we are either influenced directly by the Key of Solomon, or we're influenced by people who were influenced by the Key of Solomon. The Key of Solomon has been hugely influential, so we're going to look at the magical circle from there. And it was a 3-part circle. On the outer ring, you have the divine names. The middle ring is the angels and the elements. The inner ring is where the magician goes. And then you have symbols of power. And often the times these were pentagrams or crucifixes. And that would align it to the cosmos. And by aligning and having all these different forms, we are connecting to powerful forces. Now, a lot of people, when we think about circles, we think we're casting this for protection. And we are. Because if you've got a circle in which you are surrounded by the greatest powers of the cosmos, you're protected.
But it's not just about protection. Their circles were about presence.
Yes. So the core of the circle, though, is that it corresponds to the cosmos, and the cosmos is present in the circle. So when we are casting the circle, we are circumambulating, we are aligning it to the divine order. We are aligning it to the directions. We are aligning it to the divine order. And so it's aligned to Ma'at, it's aligned to Heka. It is activated. Since we've got all of that in place, the next question is, how does this align with the world soul? Great. So here is the Platonic alignment. As we look at that outer ring, we have the circle of same. The middle one, we have the circle of different. The inner ring, we have the material world, and then we have the cardinal directions giving us alignment within the material world.
And this all orients the whole circle to divine order and the forces that you're trying to bring down into the working.
Which means that it also aligns to the divided line, as we see all the order being in order. And that's pretty good. As we look at that, what we see is that we are directly connecting to the physical, mental, and spiritual levels of the universe through circle casting. As magicians, we can move between the layers. We can move upward to gain insight and move downward to embody change. We can connect with divine influence and utilize the mediators to enhance our magic and the correspondences to anchor our magic. We don't need to charge our objects. We don't need to charge our circle. Our circle is going to carry that charge. It's going to be the power because it is connected to endless power.
Let's look at modern applications, because although there are people who still cast circles just the way the ceremonial magicians did in the Renaissance, a lot of us don't. The people that do, I've heard of some ways they do that, because we all have a limit of space. They can take a round carpet, right, flip it over, and then they draw the whole thing on the other side of the carpet and they flip it back. That way they don't have to worry about storing it. They just flip it over when they're ready to do their magic. So, but there are other ways. For those of us who don't use inscribed physical circles, we use energy. And that is actually a metaphysical substance. It's a thought form. And we imprint that in the mental layers of the space that we're in. It is perfectly fine to cast a simple circle of white light for protection. But what a lot of us are doing now is actually the same idea of this, how the sigil of the divine power worked. We are connecting our circles to the powers that we want to work with. And here's some examples of how that can be done. Now, say you want to connect to an ancestor on Samhain. And so you're at this ritual and you want a specific ancestor to come. So everybody takes a jack-o'-lantern, they carve the jack-o'-lantern, they put the name on the jack-o'-lantern of the person they want to come and join them, and maybe take a couple of coins, because coins are associated with the boatman, to get them from one side to the other. So they put them, they light them, and then when they cast the circle, all of those jack-o'-lanterns are activated. And because each jack-o'-lantern is encoded to a particular ancestor, it becomes like a key card. They are allowed in, but the rest of the circle keeps the other things out. That's an example of using the same type of theory, but different symbology. Another example is if you were doing divination and you wanted to work with Hecate in this ritual, you could take and make a tool out of a key. So it became Hecate's key, and then cast the circle with Hecate's key and that energy. Another thing that I did with a group is we wanted to use the energy of the Tree of Life. And the Tree of Life is a map of creation. It's got 10 spheres. It's like a diagram from here to here. And each sphere is a step of that creative process of the universe. So how we cast our circle is we took and put an altar table all around the edges of the circle. And on each altar table, we put a statement of what that Sephiroth would say to us, could it speak. So, and nobody else knew what it was. One person made those statements, so they'd get there and it'd be a surprise, right? And so there was a ritual walking where everybody came in and they walked in a certain steady rate and stopped at each table, read the card, then took a stone and moved the energy with the stone to the next table. And there was enough stones that everybody could participate in that. And so we all activated each Sephiroth of the tree of life. And that became the energy and context for our circle. If you wanted to work on a relationship, what you could cast the circle with was the power of oaths. Because up there is, I mean, people have been having relationships for a long time. So there's a huge egregore for relationships. And egregores can have a guardianship power to them. So if you were to call upon certain things that were of healthy relationship traits, cast the circle around you with your partner, you would be creating it for environment by aligning it to the powers that you wanted to be working with.
We do that every year on our anniversary.
We hope that you enjoyed the presentation.
So if you made it this far, please like, subscribe, hit the bell for our notifications.
So